Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into some seriously fascinating stuff today. Crowd psychology. You know those times when people, sometimes whole societies, get caught up in this collective
Yeah,
frenzy?
so they lose their minds a bit.
Exactly. So we're going deep into history using firsthand accounts, primary sources, and also historical analyses to try to understand how these manias happen and, more importantly, what we can learn from them, right?
It's like a trip through some of history's craziest moments. Financial bubbles, social contagions, moments when everyone just seems to lose it.
And spanning centuries and continents. Who knew history could be so wild?
Well, the interesting thing is, beneath all the chaos, there's this really human story. Our need to belong, how we catch emotions from each other and how all that sometimes makes us act totally irrational.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with financial bubbles. Imagine being right in the middle of one. Our first stop, early 18th century France.
The Mississippi Scheme.
What was that?
Well, picture France drowning in debt, desperate for a solution, right? Enter Law, a financial innovator. Big ideas, bold plans.
Sounds intriguing. What'd he do?
He came up with this whole system of paper money tied to a company, the Mississippi Company. Promised vast riches from the Louisiana Territory, all that unexplored land.
So is this guy a con man, like a snake oil salesman?
Not really. He actually believed in the power of paper money, genuinely thought it could boost the economy, even understood the dangers of printing too much. But his scheme, well, it got a bit too hyped up.
Ah, too much of a good thing,
I
right?
could say that.
So what happened? Tell us about the frenzy.
Imagine a narrow Paris street, the Rue de Quincampoix. Now packed with speculators, all going crazy, buying and selling shares.
Sounds intense.
Oh, it was. One account says it was so packed, a hunchbacked man rented out his hump as a writing desk. People were desperate for a place to do their business.
You can't make this stuff up. So it wasn't just the Wall Street types, right?
Nope, everyone got caught up. Nobles, government officials, even shopkeepers and servants. They all poured their savings into Mississippi Company shares, convinced they'd be rich.
It's that dream of getting rich quick, isn't it? Being part of something big.
It's not just greed, it's wanting to belong, to be part of this wave of prosperity. Except the wave crashed hard.
Oh, I bet it did.
The bubble burst.
Yeah.
Thousands were left with nothing. John Law, well, he had to flee for his life.
Wow, what a story. So what did people learn from all this?
Well, it shook confidence in paper money big time. And the French economy took years to recover. Shows you even brilliant ideas, if they get too hyped up, can have disastrous consequences.
That's a stark warning, for sure. But it wasn't just France, was it? Didn't something similar happen in England around the same time?
Oh yeah, almost simultaneously, the South Sea Bubble.
What was that all about?
This company, the South Sea Company, they were supposed to trade with South America. Rumors of unimaginable riches, you know the drill.
The hype machine.
But here's the interesting part. Even the government got sucked in.
Wait, really? How did that happen?
Picture this. Parliament is debating this bill, the South Sea Bill, which would basically give the company a monopoly on trade with South America. And while they're debating, share prices are going crazy up and down just based on how people think the debate's going.
So they were gambling on perception, not results.
Exactly. They weren't even waiting to see if the company actually made money. They were just betting on the idea of it.
Wow. Crowd psychology in action, live from Parliament.
And again, it wasn't just about greed. There was this whole cocktail of emotions. National pride, the allure of these exotic lands. People genuinely believed England was about to dominate the world.
They drank the Kool-Aid, basically.
You could say that. But just like in France, the bubble burst with the same consequences. Financial ruin, anger, and a loss of trust in the government. It really shows you crowd psychology can affect anyone. Doesn't matter how smart you are or how high up you are. And it often happens when things are changing, when people are uncertain and looking for easy answers.
Makes sense. So I've got greed, ambition, national pride, and a sprinkle of fear. Quite a recipe for a disaster. Okay, now let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about Tulip Mania.
Yes, Tulip Mania.
I gotta say, this one really intrigues me. Flowers. A financial frenzy. It's kind of hard to wrap my head around.
I know, right? Imagine 17th century Holland and tulip bulbs, especially the rare ones with crazy colors, become more valuable than houses, more sought after than gold.
No way, seriously.
People mortgaged their homes, sold everything they had just to get their hands on these bulbs.
It wasn't just about their beauty, was it? It was like a status thing.
Exactly. Owning a rare tulip bulb was like a sign you'd made it. Wealth, sophistication, entry into the elite circles. And The prices just kept going up. Speculation, fear of missing out, the whole 9 yards.
It's amazing how something as simple as a flower could trigger all that. But I'm guessing this bubble burst too, right?
Oh, yeah. And when it did, a lot of people were wiped out, left with nothing but a bunch of overpriced flowers. It shows you social pressure, that need to keep up with the Joneses. It can make us do some really irrational things, even when what we're chasing is, well, kind of absurd.
So three very different examples, but the same pattern, this irrational behavior driven by crowd psychology. We've talked about financial bubbles, but our sources show that this madness of crowds doesn't stop there. It gets even more intense, even darker. Ready to explore how these same forces can play out in ways that are, well, frankly, a bit disturbing.
Let's do it. It's true, financial bubbles, they're dramatic, but they're just one way this whole crowd psychology thing plays out.
So what happens when it goes beyond money? When it's about beliefs, fears, maybe even violence? That's kind of scary to think about.
It can get pretty dark. Let's shift gears a bit, move into the realm of social contagions. That's where you see how fear, suspicion, even the need to fit in can spread just as fast as greed, and the consequences can be just as bad.
Okay, I'm ready for a deep dive into the dark side. Where do we start?
17th century Massachusetts, a place you might think of as all about religion and community. But there's this dark chapter there, the Salem witch trials.
Yeah, the Salem witch trials. It's like a reminder of how fear can take over a whole community. But what really caused it? Was it just religious extremism?
Religion definitely played a part, but there's more to it than that. It's about how those beliefs mixed with social anxieties, power struggles, and just that human tendency to conform, to go along with the crowd, especially when you're under pressure.
So even in a place like Salem, there were other things going on.
Oh yeah, for sure. Imagine a small community, isolated, struggling with all sorts of hardships,
Yeah.
right? Then you have a group of young girls. Maybe they're looking for attention, maybe they're dealing with their own issues, but they start acting strange, having fits, accusing people.
And in a climate of fear, those accusations become believable.
Exactly. People are scared. They want someone to blame for their problems. So they latch onto these accusations. Whispers become shouts. More and more accusations fly around. People start accusing their neighbors, maybe out of fear of being accused themselves, maybe to settle old scores, or just because everyone else is doing it.
It's amazing how quickly things can spiral out of control, how reason just goes out the window. But what's always struck me about Salem is that spectral evidence.
Ah, yes, spectral evidence.
Testimony based on dreams and visions, people claiming they saw the accused spirit doing witchcraft. Sounds crazy to us now, but back then...
Well, back then, belief in the supernatural was a big part of life. So spectral evidence, as crazy as it sounds, it carried a lot of weight.
It shows how powerful crowd psychology can be, how it can warp your perception, make you believe things you normally wouldn't. But Salem isn't just some historical curiosity. It's a warning about groupthink, about how fragile reason can be when fear takes over.
Exactly. It reminds us that even in a society that values logic and fairness, mass hysteria can still happen. And the consequences, well, we saw what happened in Salem.
Okay, so we've seen how crowd psychology can fuel financial bubbles and social panics. But what's the psychology behind it all? What makes us susceptible to these collective delusions, even the smartest among us?
That's the key question, isn't it? And the answer lies in understanding how our minds work in groups. There are these psychological principles that come into play that kind of take over.
Okay, let's get inside the mind of the crowd. What's the first principle?
Let's start with social proof. Basically, when we don't know how to act, we look to others, right? We figure if everyone else is doing it, it must be the right thing to do. Think about those scenes in Paris during the Mississippi bubble. Everyone buying up shares. It creates this feeling of, well, I better get in on this too. They must know something I don't.
We're social creatures. We look to the group for safety, guidance. But what happens when the group is wrong?
That's when things go haywire. Then there's de-individuation, where you lose your sense of self in a crowd. You become less inhibited, more likely to do what the group is doing, even if it goes against your own values.
So it's like your conscience gets lost in the crowd.
Exactly, and it can lead to some pretty bad behavior. Like in Salem, people who might normally be kind and reasonable got caught up in the frenzy, accusing their neighbors, even taking part in the persecution.
It's a sobering thought, for sure. But is there something else going on here? These principles explain how we get caught up, but what about the intensity of these episodes?
Well, there's one more principle, a big one, groupthink. This is what happens when a group, especially under pressure, becomes so obsessed with staying united, with keeping everyone happy, that they stop thinking critically. They shut down any dissenting voices.
So wanting to stay united becomes more important than truth.
Sadly, yes. In groupthink, people might have doubts, but they're too afraid to speak up to rock the boat. So the group gets further and further from reality. They become resistant to any outside information, and that can lead to some really bad decisions.
Salem, with its spectral evidence and silencing of anyone who disagreed, that's a perfect example of groupthink, isn't it? But how do these principles play out in other examples of crowd madness? Like the thugs, they were more than just a gang of criminals, right?
Right, the Thugs of India, a murderous cult that lasted for centuries. These guys weren't just bandits. They believed their killings were a religious duty sanctioned by a goddess. Their beliefs were reinforced by rituals, stories, a rigid social hierarchy.
So it was like a self-contained world where they shut out any opposing views and justified their actions through their twisted beliefs.
Exactly. Groupthink blinded them to the horror of what they were doing. It's a terrifying example of how social pressure, charismatic leadership, and a distorted worldview can combine to create delusion and violence.
It seems like none of us are immune to these psychological traps, no matter how smart we think we are. So how do we protect ourselves? Is there a way to avoid getting swept up in the madness of crowds?
That's the big question, and it's one we'll tackle in the next part of our deep dive. But for now, let's just take a moment to think about what these historical examples mean for us. What lessons can we learn from them as we navigate our own social world?
Welcome back to our deep dive into the madness of crowds. It's been pretty wild so far, right? Financial bubbles, witch hunts, all driven by this powerful force of crowd psychology.
Yeah, we've seen how these stories from the past, they're not just entertaining, they actually teach us something about ourselves.
Right. They show how even the most rational person can get swept up by social pressure, emotions, that urge to conform.
Exactly.
Okay, but before we wrap up, I want to look at a couple more examples. Our sources talk about some events that seem, well, kind of bizarre, almost comical.
Oh yeah, those are some of the most interesting ones.
Like the dancing mania? What was that all about?
Well, imagine this. Europe. Different times in history, you have these groups of people, hundreds of them sometimes, just dancing uncontrollably. For days, even weeks, they dance till they collapsed, then get up and start dancing again.
Dancing mania? That sounds like something out of a movie. What could possibly cause that?
Well, nobody knows for sure. Some historians think it was like mass hysteria, maybe brought on by stress, social and psychological factors. Think about it, plagues, famines, wars. Maybe dancing was a way to cope with all that trauma.
Like a collective release.
Yeah, a way to let out all that anxiety and fear together. It's interesting how these seemingly crazy behaviors can actually serve a purpose. Give people a sense of relief, of connection, especially in tough times.
So maybe there was a psychological function to it, even if it seemed irrational on the surface.
Right. But there are other theories, too. Some think it was caused by ergot poisoning.
Ergot poisoning, what's that?
It's a fungus that can grow on rye bread. It can cause hallucinations, convulsions, that kind of thing.
Wow, so maybe a biological cause, but still playing out in this social group setting?
Exactly. It shows that crowd behavior is rarely simple. It's usually a mix of things. Biology, psychology, social factors, culture, all playing a role.
It's complicated stuff. Okay, speaking of complicated, what about the Children's Crusade?
Ah, the Children's Crusade, a tragic story. In 1212, thousands of children, some really young, set off from Europe to the Holy Land.
To Holy Land, why?
They believed they had this divine mission to convert the Muslims peacefully. Imagine that, just kids, some as young as 8 years old, setting out on this incredible journey.
Wow, that's heartbreaking. What happened to them?
Sadly, a lot of them died along the way, from hunger, disease. Others were shipwrecked, sold into slavery. Very few actually reached the Holy Land, and none of them accomplished their mission.
That's so sad. What would make so many children do something like that?
It was a mix of things, for sure. Religious fervor, social and economic unrest back in Europe. There were even charismatic preachers telling stories of miracles and divine intervention, inspiring these kids.
So it was crowd contagion, but with religion as the driving force.
You could say that. It's both inspiring and tragic to see how deeply children can be affected by these social forces, these shared beliefs. It shows that crowd psychology doesn't discriminate, and it highlights the power of belief systems, especially religious ones, to shape our actions.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground today. Financial bubbles, witch hunts, dancing manias, even a children's crusade. And while the events themselves are different, there are these underlying patterns of crowd psychology that keep popping up. But here's the big question. Are we any less susceptible to the madness of crowds today than people were centuries ago? I mean, we've learned so much, right?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the answer is, well, it's complicated. Yes, we have more information. We understand psychology better now. But the basic human needs, those social dynamics that fuel crowd behavior, they haven't changed. We're still vulnerable to emotional contagion, to social pressure, to that pull of conformity.
So crowd psychology is still at play, but maybe it's showing up in different ways today.
Exactly. Think about how information spreads now with social media, online echo chambers, rumors, and misinformation spreading like wildfire. It's the perfect breeding ground for the madness of crowds.
And it's not just online, is it? We see it in politics, in the financial markets, even in everyday life.
Absolutely, it's everywhere. The point is, crowd psychology is not a thing of the past. It's a force that shapes our world constantly, often in ways we don't even realize. That's why it's so important to understand it, to develop our critical thinking skills and emotional intelligence so we can navigate this complex social world.
So how can we protect ourselves from the negative side of crowd psychology? How do we avoid becoming mindless followers?
Here are a few things to keep in mind. First, be skeptical. Don't just accept information or opinions because they're popular. Question assumptions, seek out different viewpoints, be willing to challenge the status quo.
So think for yourself, even when it's hard.
Exactly. Second, be aware of your own biases. We all have them, and they can make us easy targets for manipulation. When you're feeling strong emotions, take a step back. Ask yourself, is this affecting my judgment?
Like having an internal alarm system for our emotions.
Exactly. And finally, remember, you always have a choice. You don't have to follow the crowd. You can think for yourself, stand up for what you believe in, even when it's tough.
So be a conscious participant, not a passive follower. This has been a fascinating journey exploring these crazy episodes of crowd madness and learning about the psychology behind them. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one last thought. What are the crowds you're drawn to? What beliefs and behaviors do they promote? And are you leading or are you being led? That's something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and keep thinking critically.